Good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. I am Paul Clements from the Climate Change Working Group at Western Michigan University, and I will be introducing what is our last keynote session. I'll tell you a few more words about that in a moment. However, I first want to remind us that Hurricane Melissa struck Jamaica yesterday and today with the strongest winds this was the strongest hurricane that Jamaica has ever experienced. I think 75% or so of the island has lost its power, and who knows what destruction will have been wrought by that hurricane. It's also passed over Cuba. It's causing a lot more harm also throughout the area. And so our thoughts go certainly to those who are suffering the effects of that hurricane and to friends and family who might not know what's going on. Also, just on a practical note, a number of people have been asking about recordings for the panels, and they are being posted as soon as practical in the lobby session, the lobby that you entered when you joined the symposium. So you can go and find many of the recordings already there, and they will also be posted on the symposium website in a week or so after the symposium is over. So today's session, we've made a little bit of a change. Rather than Sarah Rosengartner giving a keynote address, Sarah Rosengartner and Lori Ashley are going to have more of a conversation. Well, I don't know what they're going to say, so I'll let you find out from them. They will be addressing certainly many of the themes that Sarah Rosengartner already had in mind. Lori was going to be in another session, but there are issues there, so I'm sure she'll bring up some of her themes. However, they're also certainly going to be welcoming questions from the audience. So as usual, our chat function is off, but our Q&A function is available. And while they're speaking, if you want to write your questions or comments into the Q&A, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom, and please write your question there. And then towards the end, depending on how time goes on, we may have a chance to unmute people for asking questions verbally. So let me first give a little bit of background for our two speakers. Sarah Rosengartner is the Deputy Managing Director of the Global Center for Climate Mobility, GCCM. She leads the GCCM's regional initiatives in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean, and directs its knowledge and policy hub. She was a fellow at the Zollberg Institute for Migration and Mobility and regularly serves as a lecturer at Columbia University. Before joining the GCCM, Sarah was a senior advisor at the Open Society Foundations, where she helped create city-based coalitions such as the Mayor's Migration Council, the Mayor's Mechanism of the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and the Africa-Europe Mayor's Dialogue. Previously, Sarah advised UN agencies, governments, and global leaders, including the Elders and the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Migration, the late Peter Sutherland. She played a coordinating role in aligning stakeholders' policy proposals for the Global Compact for Migration, and has co-authored several agenda-setting global policy reports related to migration governance. Laura Ashley, who will be in conversation with Sarah, is a climate resilience specialist with over 20 years of experience globally. She specializes in advancing climate resilience considerations in decision-making and serves as an advisor on policy and programming. Lori has advised USAID and its partners on climate adaptation policy and programming, representing the United States on the UNFCCC Least Developed Countries Expert Group, and led climate and migration efforts at USAID. Her background includes designing, implementing, and advising climate adaptation and resilience strategies and programs in food and water security, climate information services, and more. Also, just a reminder to everyone, this session is recorded. And with that, I will turn it over to Lori and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was a really kind introduction. And let me say, I'm thrilled to share the floor with Sarah Rosengartner today from the Global Center on Climate and Migration. Are you hearing me all right?
Yep, I hear you.
Great. Well, I wanted to kick us off with a question for Sarah. And the context here is, over the last 5 years or so, I was at USAID, and climate and migration really came on our agenda strong in 2021. So in 2021, I was sort of head down at USAID, really grappling with the issues of climate and migration. How are we going to get this on the agenda at our agency? How are we going to advance this issue? So I had my head down working on this, and all of a sudden I looked up and there was the Global Center on Climate and Migration. And I was like, oh my goodness, we're not alone, which of course we weren't, but it was really wonderful to just realize this initiative was existed and getting off the ground and really making strong moves and impacts in the world of climate and migration. So, with that context, Sarah, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about what is your story or perspective on the origins of the Global Center on Climate and Migration? As I was like over here doing my thing, you were over there like building this really important initiative that's gone on to have real global impact. And I'd love to hear some of that story. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie, and it's a pleasure also to be here with you and with all the colleagues that have joined us. Thanks for joining and for listening in. And please, follow Paul's invitation to put questions and comments in the chat as we go along. Thanks for giving me the opportunity, Laurie, to speak a little bit about the kind of thinking behind the Global Center and especially kind of the framing of this issue. And actually, we're the Climate Mobility Center, and I will talk a little bit about this. No, it's a great starting point because quite a lot of work actually from the outside went into the question of like, what should this be named and how do we name what we're talking about? And I wanted to start there just because as we entered this space, as we entered the kind of very fragmented space of climate, migration, displacement, planned relocation, one critical question was, how do we find a language that can connect the different people being engaged in this? We all kind of recognize that climate change affects the movement of people. People are being forced to move because of the impacts of climate change. And yet, again, everybody had a different terminology to talk about this and a different entry point to kind of address this issue, whether it was more of a threat, more of an opportunity. Is it fundamentally something that people could use to adapt? Is it a loss and a damage? So there were all these different lenses, and to begin to kind of have a common agenda, common approach to this issue, we felt it was critical to have a common language. And I wanted to start there because I think we're still in that discussion. I often hear pushback around the lingo of climate mobility. And I think we struggle to, put something into the world that isn't yet underpinned by the things that we collect in data, right? Like if we talk about climate mobility, there isn't currently a survey or a data source that would really capture this phenomenon. We have very disparate sources of data that capture different pieces of movement. Again, like we'll have census data, we'll have displacement tracking data, we'll have data on refugees, but none of that captures in and of itself the reality of climate mobility. And so we're trying to create a new reality by starting with a new concept. And I think I want to spend a moment maybe to talk about how this is different from previous concepts and why we landed on it, if that works for you. So I think we see that concepts are usually brought into the world to create a constituency, right? Like to connect people around an issue and to say, we are the people who care about this issue. And then also to connect with wider windows of opportunities or policy agendas where people see an inroad to influencing how policy is made, how reality is seen, and how resources are allocated ultimately. And so we've seen in the space that we're looking at, we had environmental migrants, very much a concept that I think was put forward in reaction to the Rio process, right? IOM brought this forward in reaction to the Rio 1992 conference to look at how migration could be included in that space and brought forward as an important consideration for this growing movement of sustainable development. You have the notion of climate refugees that was really advanced in reaction to the realization that we have protection gaps for people that might be forced to move across borders. But that concept had its limitations in the sense that, we don't have a legal basis for calling these people refugees, and we've had a lot of pushback from the actors that are in refugee protection to not use that terminology, but also because in reality, we know a lot of people are not crossing borders. We've seen the attempt to frame an agenda around the notion of disaster displacement, so sidestepping this bifurcation that we have in the system around, on the one hand, migrants, on the other hand, refugees. So using displacement as kind of an umbrella term. But again, if we look at the disaster displacement agenda, it was largely framed around cross-border movement, so not addressing the internal dimension. And it really sidestepped one of the critical political issues, which is the issue of climate change and the questions of responsibility and accountability that come with framing this issue in the context of the climate change conversation. And so we were looking at this situation, at these different terminologies, and saying, okay, we need to anchor this in the conversation around climate justice, which is one of the central political struggles of our time. So this question of who is responsible and how can responsibility be shared in a way that doesn't leave those who have least contributed to the problem most burdened by it. And secondly, using the term mobility to bridge the disparate forms of movement that we see associated with climate, right? The evidence tells us people are moving internally a lot. There can be temporary and permanent movements. Some of them move in an organized fashion. Some of them move spontaneously. And so we have all these different types of movement. Some people don't move at all and they don't want to move. And so we're using climate mobility as a concept to create a kind of common roof under which people addressing all these different disparate forms of movement can come together. I will maybe stop here and we can talk a little bit about some of the pushback against that concept, but I'll leave it here because you were talking about climate migration quite a bit, and I would be curious to hear how that word choice was landed on, or if there was reflection on it at USAID at all.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I really appreciate that background. And I 100% agree with the choice of mobility. One of the points I wanted to make later, but it's great to bring it up now, is just how complex climate and mobility is, which is a reason to really take a systems approach to the work that we do in this space. But part of that complexity is 100% about why and how people move, recognizing that there are very specific circumstances to every region, to every country, to every community, to every family, to every individual that leads to mobility. And to oversimplify it does a disservice, I think, to the people and the circumstances that they are dealing with. So I do like mobility. I use migration quite a bit, in part just as also thinking about it as a bit of an umbrella term. The way IOM defines migration includes kind of the full spectrum of mobility, but recognizing that not most of the world is versed in the IOM definition guidelines. I think that mobility is a really good approach. Maybe just another reason why I talk about migration The main reason is using it as an umbrella term, but yeah, I think that's the thing to mainly say about it. It is just feels more inclusive than talking about displacement or refugees, which seem to have a more specific meaning. So migration seems to have a bit broader of a meaning, but I agree that mobility is even broader to provide that umbrella for the real diverse and complex types of circumstances that people are facing.
Yeah, and I think it does allow us. I mean, I have heard pushback to say this is too much sugarcoating it, right? Like people are really being forced to move, and mobility sounds too positive.
Mm.
And yet, I think we also have seen pushback, especially from some of the more affected countries, against the kind of discourse around, yeah, displacement refugees, like saying, we don't want to end up being climate displaced persons or climate refugees. And so, we need to look for solutions that allow us forms of mobility or forms of movement that would not be, displacement, like that would look differently. And I think using, at least in my mind, using the term of mobility also allows us to think about new types of agreements or new forms of governance for this that lead us a little bit out of the existing forms and shapes that we have for this. So to look at not just facilitating people's movement from A to B, or not just being reactive to when crisis has happened, but also to look at the broader kind of circumstances that come with making sure people can make a new home fundamentally whenever they have moved, and all the conditions that are attached to that.
Yeah, 100%. Maybe just to add on to that, we all know this, but it's worth reminding ourselves that people, humans, have moved since the very beginning of us as a form of adaptation and access to resources, access to opportunities. It's almost the heart of who we are. And I don't say that to diminish how place-based we are as well. We love our homes, we love our communities, but mobility has long been a tool of humanity, which is why we are all where we are now. And just an example to illustrate, I think the point you were making, Mercy Corps, an American NGO, has done really interesting work in Niger and ECOWAS, facilitating mobility from southern Niger to destination cities in Western Africa on a temporary basis so people can access other livelihood opportunities during the lean season. It's a program called Planning for Productive Migration, with a really interesting set of interventions aimed at supporting migrants and their households in this journey. And their findings show increased food security among households who have a migrant during the lean season. So it's a really interesting finding and demonstrating how migration, mobility can serve to advance resilience and food security in certain situations. We know that's not always true, but just to demonstrate an arena where that mobility is facilitating adaptation and resilience.
Did you find, I know you had the role of, making that case in USAID, I think.
Mm.
Did you find it difficult to kind of get buy-in and to, first of all, I think just taking this issue on at all, and second of all, taking it on as you just framed it, like resilience or adaptation intervention?
Yeah, for sure. Um, and rightfully so, but there's a number of barriers to trying to tackle this issue. And one of them, in the context of USAID, um, some of you may know, USAID was a behemoth of an organization until it was dismantled last spring. So it had an average annual staff of 10,000 people and an average annual budget over the last decade of $23 billion. So it was a huge organization. Now, a big chunk of that was focused on humanitarian assistance, really working with people that were displaced by conflict, by disasters, by climate elements, et cetera. And so we had a really big chunk of our organization that was intensely focused on the context of displacement, and really pushed back, for sure, as you're noting, on the idea that mobility could also be a form of adaptation and resilience. And, that is not without merit. I absolutely see where that pushback is coming from. And in so many cases of forced displacement, it's not adaptation, it's not resilience. It is only decimating communities, as we well know, and as Paul raised this most recent example of Hurricane Melissa in the Caribbean. So, but to kind of push the envelope a little bit on recognizing the complexity and nuance that even when people are faced with climate risk and impacts, there is still the opportunity, or there's still the conditions where people move towards opportunity in a way that can be positive. And I will also say that part of what allowed us to think about this is that USAID had so much work addressing displacement. So I'm thinking of a time at the Global Forum on Migration and Development a couple years ago where a person from the youth delegation came up to me and said, I really disagree with adaptation, with migration as a form of adaptation. And I said, I hear you. Absolutely. I understand where that's coming from. But I have to tell you, from somebody who sits at USAID, where 99% of what we do is to help people stay in place. That is the vast majority of what we do. There is room to also recognize that being on the move can be positive, or can come with opportunity as well as risk and challenge, and that there's a role for a development organization to reduce that risk, to make mobility safer, and to help people find opportunity through mobility. I might have gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but those are some thoughts.
No, I think I mean, I was, prior to getting into this nexus of climate and mobility, or climate and migration, for a long time working in the development field. And basically, I feel like there's a lot of parallel to, at the time, migration actors trying to get the development folks to care about migration. And now, let's say again, like the migration and displacement people trying to get the climate folks to care about so I see a lot of parallels where I think there's often this kind of like knocking at the door and being like, how do you place this issue of people moving, whether it's displacement or migration, in the context of these larger government prioritized agendas or strategies, whether it's development or climate action? How do we get them to care about the people who are being displaced or the people who have to move? And I think we see some countries where this is a national level question, right? Like where the whole society is in some form impacted, obviously putting this at the top of their agenda. And in other countries, I think we continue to see, the issue being considered as kind of like part of many larger adaptation challenges that countries face, or development challenges that countries face, and where it's a much harder case to make why this should be the top thing they care about, or even among the top things they care about. And so I think, again, like with this climate mobility framing, the goal is also to see, I think, how can we create a common understanding across these countries, but for some it's already evident that this is top of mind. For others, it's much more, another maybe element of adaptation that helps them make the case why they need support. And I think what we're seeing is definitely an agenda that I think would need to bring together both the right to stay, like this clearly the investments and adaptation that need to be scaled up, but also recognizing that some people will have to move or will want to move, and making that possible. But my sense is the constituency for the latter is always somewhat weaker. Um, and there's a harder mountain to climb, the higher mountain, steeper mountain to climb there. Oh, somebody wants to get into the conversation. And so from my perspective, as we try to, create kind of a common umbrella for climate mobility, and array different partners, different constituencies around this concept to see how they can bring a part of the solution, part of the agenda, and part of the solution. The key, so I see kind of a tension between this agenda building effort, right? Like articulating why it's important that we see disparate realities through a common lens, right? And to create that kind of understanding that we're part of the same struggle here, right? Like all these people are facing a similar situation, even though it might look different from context to context, but fundamentally we're all facing the same threat of losing our homes and having to grapple with decisions about where to go in that context and what that means and how to make a new home. So having that as a kind of communal, common situation assessment across countries, getting to a common understanding around what that means, like what is needed in terms of action to address it. And I think that's kind of like the broad tent building that we're involved in. And at the same time, then I can also see that when you then talk to a specific government and say, well, you need to address climate mobility, then you're back to this question of, okay, but what are the pieces, or like what the different actors need to do, right? Like there is no obviously bureaucracy for climate mobility in any country. So you are back to the question of, okay, which ministry should then be the lead on this? How should others, what's their piece of the pie? What do they need to do? What does this mean for them, right? So you're back into like disaggregating what you just tried to aggregate. Um, and so I'm curious how you've experienced that. I know the US had like a whole of government effort to address climate migration that involved quite a bit of this, bringing different parts of government together. And at the same time, again, like we're back to, everybody needs to do their piece of the response at the end of the day. And I wonder how you've experienced that in the US context, or if that was part of what you were exposed to.
Yeah, thank you. I want to speak to that. And then I want to also come back to you about this question of scale a little bit, which comes into, I think, this, agenda building effort and the roles of different players at different scales. I guess I see one role of folks working at a global level is exactly what you're saying, this agenda building effort and keeping this topic on the agenda. But working globally, we often find ourselves in conversations with national governments. But in reality, the scale where a lot of the impacts, circumstances of climate and migration are taking place is at the urban scale, like a city level government. And I know you have a lot of background in that area. So I'm going to try to answer your question, but then I want to come back to you and hear a little bit about your thoughts about working at the city level and the national level and how those, what are sort of the dynamics there. But in terms of, in the US, we had this really interesting confluence of stakeholders and actors and agendas in 2021 in a way that allowed us to really move forward on climate and migration. And it was only in retrospect that I sort of saw how this came together in a way that really allowed us to do some of that agenda building and agenda setting within our own government. So just as some background, starting in 2017 or so, USAID has a big on the ground presence and was increasingly seeing the dynamics of climate change impacts and mobility play out. And so USAID started work on a paper called People on the Move, working on adaptation and resilience in the context of climate mobility. And Karishma has kindly agreed to put some of these papers in the chat. As an aside, let me say that one of the many things that was tragic about the loss of USAID was essentially the burning of libraries. USAID had an immense library of evidence, and much of that is now dispersed or gone or hard to find. So I've pulled together a number of USAID and US government reports, and Karishma's kindly agreed to put them in here just for those of you who might like to reference them later. So backing up, USAID put together this paper, People on the Move, to start to outline options for USAID programming and policy to work on climate and migration issues. So that was really a sort of a bottom-up technical practitioner approach to this issue. So that started going on in 2017, 2018, 2019. In 2021, we had the new administration coming in, and IRAP, the International Refugee Assistance Project, was also in the mix. They are a legal group really pushing for human rights, particularly in the context of refugees and migration. And they worked with the Biden administration on an executive order that directed all agencies of the US government to plan for the impacts of climate change on migration. So we had this confluence of sort of the legal advocacy world with the politicians in the White House in the United States, as well as technical people working in the field in USAID, all coming to say, this is an important issue that we need to be addressing. And the result of that, in part, was the White House report that Karishma kindly put in the chat, and an interagency working group across US government that together came together on a regular basis to work on how to move this issue forward. And so you can see in the chat the White House report, as well as a fact sheet that was 2 years after the launch of report that documents some of the accomplishments of that time. So, I mean, I raised that in part to say, like, that might sound very internal, but even like shifting the ship internally in a large bureaucracy takes a lot of work. I mean, we're talking about, so many people with so many priority agenda items, and to get people to really think about climate migration and how does that come to bear on the work they're doing? How can their work be better by bringing in a climate lens and a mobility lens? That in and of itself becomes a pretty big task. So maybe just, one of the things that you and I talked about earlier today, Sarah, was what are some of the barriers and opportunities for really doing this agenda setting? And I will just say that within USAID, a couple of things that come to mind are exactly what you've already mentioned. That, we were working with people with climate backgrounds, people with migration and displacement backgrounds, as well as we were trying to get all of our sector and regional colleagues on board to think about this issue. So just figuring out how to talk about it in a way that resonated with people and people could see their role in this issue was a huge piece of the puzzle. And so I'm sort of talking about this in the context of USAID and the US government, but I think across our work, all of us are dealing with this issue of how to bring different groups of people together to work on this issue. But there were a couple of really important opportunities at USAID as well. In 2022, USAID launched a new climate strategy. And in that climate strategy, we took that chance to very carefully build migration and mobility into that strategy to make sure that it reflected the climate and migration realities and that climate and migration was highlighted throughout this strategy. And that's something that I'm really proud of in terms of our work. And that climate strategy is also in the chat there. But part of that was that there are 5 intermediate results within that strategy that addressed migration. So again, this is a climate strategy, but with migration embedded in it. So under IR 1.2, for example, there's the aim to address climate-related migration by working with communities and migrants to limit displacement and to support safer and more productive migration, including in sending and receiving communities. I've got to say that was something I worked really hard to make sure was prominent in the strategy. But we have other IRs that also looked at tenure and resource rights, including for migrants to support climate resilience. We talk about leveraging remittances and diaspora investing, these substantial and reliable sources of capital to promote resilience. We talk about supporting social cohesion and peace building and equitable representation in communities affected by climate-related mobility. And we talk about investing in capacity and assets that travel with people on the move. That means things like good health, good education, transferable job skills, access to mobile or transferable assets and finance, mobile safety nets, etc. So those were just some of the ways that we were thinking about integrating this issue, getting it on the agenda, integrating it, and then really building it in to different elements of the organization.
And where does that go now? I mean, I know the organization is not there to kind of push this, right? But I imagine you work with partners. What do you see, if anything, still kind of out there that has survived the dismantling of USAID, whether it's just ideas or concepts or projects that are still running because people were able to find funding? Like, how do you see this survive, or have you seen it survive?
Yeah. I would say maybe the ultimate test of the sustainability of one's interventions is to disappear overnight and see what's left. It's sort of, I would not recommend it as a way to test how sustainable your work is. But anyways, so much has been lost. And another thing Karishma put in the chat there was our colleague Jocelyn Perry at Refugees International. She wrote a piece back in April about, what are the impacts of the loss of USAID in terms of climate resilience and displacement. So I'm really grateful to her for doing the work to pull that information together. That said, so yes, I mean, we had a really ambitious climate strategy to support climate resilience of 250,000 people by 2030. It was a really exciting time to be working on these issues that really felt meaningful and that were making meaningful impact. What is left? So there are a lot of partners out there locally and regionally that are continuing to operate. There's also a lot of partners that weren't able to continue work in the absence of funds from USAID. So, I mean, just a couple of really heartening examples, and I have to hold on to the heartening examples in the face of so much loss. We all do. But for example, I mean, just a couple program examples. I think conceptually, I don't know, I would like to think that the work that the US did on climate and mobility and really being part of the donor community to push on this issue would lead to continued effort. But I think the disappearance of the U.S. is really demoralizing, and I'm not entirely sure how that will play out. But I would love to mention a couple of programs that USAID funded that are continuing with real impacts for people. One of those is in Somalia. It's the Scaling Durable Solutions work, and USAID partnered with IOM on that work, but IOM is continuing with other resources. So you might know that in Somalia, it's the country is home to 3.5 million IDPs, nearly 20% of the country's population. And there's a really high rate of urbanization. So most people that are displaced are not going home because of the impacts of climate and conflict, security. At home, people are choosing to stay in urban areas where they have better access to livelihoods, services, and security. So this program, Scaling Durable Solutions, is continuing to work with IDPs and local governments. So with IDPs, it is the idea that people are permanently moving to urban areas. So it's supporting people through rental subsidies and housing options, livelihood support through access to finance and training, as well as improved access to services. And then working with governments, local governments at the city level on urban planning efforts specifically to address climate risk and especially around access to water and electricity. So that is work that is super important and is continuing. And just an anecdote, sort of coming back to mobility and resilience, one thing we saw in this program is that often, extended families end up with some part of the family remaining in urban area, in rural areas, and some part of the family moving to urban areas. And what we saw was families providing support in both directions. So certainly IDPs that were getting a foothold in urban areas, starting to make some money, were sending money home to people in rural areas. But meanwhile, family members in rural areas were sending food to people in urban areas. So it really was this example of sort of mutual support going both ways that improved resilience. I'll try to be a little bit quicker, but I did want to mention in Colombia, USAID worked with the Colombian government and other partners on migrant integration centers. And these migrant integration centers didn't target people on the move related to climate. They were really in response to the 2.8 million Venezuelan migrants and 500,000 returning Colombian refugees that have moved to Colombia in the last decade, seeking education, healthcare, food, and really a better life. So these are not climate migrants, yet when people land in Colombia with very few resources, they often land in climate risk areas. So for example, in the city of Cali, migrants were making their homes on the dike system there, which is designed to prevent floods, but this is putting them right in the way because they were on top of the system of potentially deadly floods in this region that's experiencing increasingly intense rainfall. So the migrant integration centers provided a whole range of services, including documentation like work permits, residence cards, also access to services, health, education, childcare, access to employment services, and entrepreneurship training. So these 250,000 people accessed these services. 75% of those were migrants, but 25% of them were receiving community members. And it was really important, built into the design of these integration centers, that they were open to migrants and local community members in ways that wouldn't exacerbate any social tensions. So the good news is that that work was done in close partnership with the Colombian government, and they are continuing that work. Just to give a few examples, Sarah, and I think I went on a bit long.
No,
But maybe this
yeah.
is an avenue to come back to you about the city level interventions, since it's interesting that both those examples were really operating at a city level with city governments. And I'm curious about your reflections working with cities through GCCM.
Yeah, I think I mean and I'll come to this. I just wanted to make a link to the question around the kind of what's left, because I do think that at the end of the day, we're trying to connect the actors, whether they're governments or other types of stakeholders that are already working on this issue, right, from the most like from different perspectives, different entry points, and so I think it would be a shame to kind of leave knowledge and expertise that has been built on the table. And so again, like I think looking at how can things that had been conceived, started, and so on be picked up would be really great to do, and also just to connect with the actors that were already starting to be active on these things, on these topics. On the urban dimension, and I think for me it's interesting because working with cities, I think the whole categorization becomes much less important for them, right? Like I remember that the whole question of like, what kind of status do people have? Are they migrants? Are they refugees? Are they IDPs? Um, is a little less relevant, because at the end of the day, at the city level, the needs are the needs, right? Like, so like regardless of what your category of status is, you need housing and access to schools and water and what have you. And so I think that question of how do we categorize those people is less important than it is in a national level conversation. So that I think is a big difference. Uh, my sense is that a lot of the urban governments that are vocal on this issue of climate mobility are really, coming from a background of trying to integrate climate action with more inclusive development at the city level. So really trying to see how they can do urbanization, or how they can, develop their cities in a way that gives opportunity to people on the margins, and that then includes often migrants and refugees. Um, but I think we also know that not all cities are in that space, right? Like there's a good reason also for why I guess a lot of people who land in urban areas still end up in quite vulnerable situations. Um, and so while I think that it's very important to work with city actors, I also think there's maybe a risk to kind of over emphasizing kind of that locus versus, as you just mentioned, like the kind of connectivity between areas, and how do we not lose sight that cities aren't kind of islands onto themselves, but exist in as part of larger systems. And so unless they're kind of like thought of as part of those systems, we're not going to get to probably sustainable solutions either. So I think we had a discussion earlier around like, well, so how do you solve this question of where to really put your eggs, if you will, in which basket, if you want to move this agenda forward, right, in a particular country context. And I think again, like the advantage that I see of having a broad conception of climate mobility, and to being able to have different actors connect to this agenda, is that you can also see, and I think you mentioned this, where is their momentum, like where is at the national level, does the government have a real interest? But I think this then also goes to the cities, right? Like you want to work with cities if you see that there is momentum, if you see that there's an appetite to move things. So ultimately, I guess it's a question of like, where is a good vehicle, whether it's a particular ministry or a particular city government, to move solutions forward that provide better opportunities for people. And I think, again, like a broad concept gives you that wiggle room to have multiple entry points. I see Paul coming online, so I think this means we probably have some questions to answer.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really interesting and engaged and helpful discussion. We actually have a comment from one of my students, from Fatin Al-Sharmani. So I'm just going to read it and let you respond however you wish. Whether we use climate migrant or climate mobility, it's essential to unify the terminology in a way that serves political engagement rather than deters it. The term migrant often triggers political resistance or securitized responses, while mobility offers a more neutral and policy-friendly framing that can bring more actors to the table. Therefore, unifying the terminology around climate mobility may be more strategic for advancing inclusive and solution-oriented politics. Any thoughts on this comment? Yeah, you're muted. Sarah, you're muted, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, I would say thank you, Fatin. I think I would agree with this. Again, like if you go down to the city level, the challenge is people think you're talking about buses and scooters. But I think, yes, your point is well taken. And I agree. I think that sadly, migration is often, a difficult political issue, both within countries and between countries. And so sidestepping that has advantages, even if you will eventually butt up against the same difficult questions, but it does allow you to not hit them right up front.
That was our one question. I'm going to remind us that at 3 o'clock, there is another panel starting. So that is our hard deadline. And I'm going to take this opportunity as just being here who I am right now to ask another question myself. And so when we look at all these concepts of mobility and migrant and refugee and all that, a sort of cross-cutting issue is the level of vulnerability. Because I think that we find people in all these categories who are extraordinarily vulnerable, or in the old days, we would say very, very poor levels of poverty, but vulnerability is maybe a broader term. And in under all these categories, we also have some people who have some resources, who can kind of make it on their own one way or another. Also, if we look at our context, we see already that resources are far less than are needed. And as we can see the need expanding, it's probably going to be the case on an ongoing basis, that we're going to be very resource constrained. I think there is some kind of ethical consensus that the priority should go to the more vulnerable, but I don't think it's a very deep consensus. And certainly, when we talk about governments, there's no consensus at all that we should focus on the most vulnerable, in many cases. But I think for the international community, that is a very relevant concern. So my question is, as a sort of a cross-cutting concern, how do we push to focus the solutions where they are most needed under all these different categories, internally displaced person, across the board?
I'll say something. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Paul. I think I see the kind of the use of the climate mobility, climate displacement lens, kind of its primary use in a way, I think, for a lot of adaptation planning. So like you engage with the government, they're thinking about how to do climate adaptation or even development. For me, introducing climate mobility, climate displacement has really that function of basically saying there are specific areas in your country, specific communities, groups of people that you should be particularly concerned about as you're thinking about your climate adaptation strategy. So not everybody in your country is equally vulnerable or equally exposed. And so here are the areas where the risk of displacement is particularly high, or where people have already been displaced, and you should pay particular attention to those. So that is exactly, I think, the use, in my view, of this concept or of this lens in adaptation and development planning. I think globally speaking, in terms of consensus building, I think the question is, and our chairman of our board, Mr. Carlos Alvarado, former president of Costa Rica, I think put it nicely at our Climate Mobility Summit. He was talking about, the UN Security Council having been formed in response to particular security threats after the Second World War. And I think if we are thinking about, climate displacement and the fact that people, could lose their homes as one of the great human security threats of this century, then I think, thinking about like what is the governance response, right? It's not going to look like the UN Security Council for sure, but like what would be the responsive governance to that type of threat diagnosis, I think is an interesting question. And again, like one where I think we need to think through who are the actors that need to be part of that, and how can we build a coalition also on the resource side that can not just kind of agree on what needs to happen, but can also make it happen, like can resource it. And that will have to be a coalition that, again, like looks quite different from the current Security Council.
Lori, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I really appreciate all of that. Let me just say, from a USAID perspective, one of the things we grappled with was working in fragile and conflict-affected settings. These being some of the most vulnerable people in the world, living and trying to make a go of it in these conflict-affected areas. And these are very hard to work in places. If you want to try to support climate adaptation, support resilience, it's expensive, it's hard, it's very risky. All of your investments could be wiped away in the course of a conflict very quickly. Yet we know that these are some of the most important places to be working in terms of level of vulnerability. So you contrast that with, let's say Costa Rica, working in Costa Rica, where we have really robust civil society there. We also have a lot of migrants coming into Costa Rica that have a lot of needs. And I just illustrate that to say, like, you've got these different populations in different places, somewhat different levels of vulnerability, but a lot of need, and your approaches are just different. If you've got a robust civil society that you can work with them, incentivize them through resources to scale and replicate what they're doing in more areas and reach more people, for example. But in a fragile and conflict-affected setting, your strategy is going to be much different and likely more intensive. So I don't know, just to say there's always going to be tensions about how to allocate scarce resources between really risky but really high need areas and less risky but also in need areas.
Well, and with that very relevant insight, I will call this session to a close, and thank both Lori and Sarah for their really great discussion and insights. Thank our audience for being part of our audience. Thanks for those who've asked questions, and I hope you will be able to continue. We have one more session going and then a closing, and that will be the end of our symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to Karishma for all the links in the chat.
Mm-hmm.